For more than 100 years, Africa dug it out. Africa transported it. Africa shipped it away, and someone else made most of the money. But what if the model is finally changing? Because something is happening in Africa right now, and most people have not realized how big it could be. One African country has just taken a step that could shock one of the world's most important mineral supply chains. The Democratic Republic of Congo has suspended exports of copper and cobalt concentrates while pushing for more processing closer to home. And this is why we should care. Cobalt, copper, they are not just minerals sitting in the ground. They are part of the machinery behind the modern world. Batteries, electric vehicles, electronics, energy infrastructure, the technology of tomorrow. The DRC is a huge player in the supply chain. So here's the question. Why should Africa provide the raw materials while somebody else captures the big value? Think about your phone. Think about electric cars. Think about the batteries powering the world. Now imagine discovering that one of the most important pieces of that future is coming from African soil, but the biggest profits are being reaped somewhere else. That is where the story gets interesting, because Africa isn't simply asking who wants to buy our minerals. Africa is increasingly asking what will happen if we process them ourselves, and that changes everything, because there's a massive difference between selling a rock and selling what that rock becomes. Raw copper, one value. Refined copper, high value. Components, higher gain, finished technology. Now you're talking about an entire industry ecosystem. Jobs, factories, skills, computers, tax revenue, infrastructure, and wealth that circulates inside the continent. But wait, because there's a problem with this idea, a huge one. You can't build an industrial economy with a policy announcement alone. You need infrastructure, from electricity, roads, railway, ports, factories, financing, and we also need customers. No more raw exports. So if Africa says no more raw exports without building the ability to process this material, the problem doesn't disappear, it becomes bigger. That is why the next part of this story may be more important than the minerals themselves. Africa needs a market big enough to support African industry, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. This idea is simple. Instead of African economies operating as a dozen of relatively small markets, connect them, make trade easier, make it cheaper, make it faster, and suddenly a company in one African country does not have to think about its own population. It can think about a continental market, hundreds of millions of potential customers. Now here's the crazy part. The African Union says about 85% of Africa's trade still flows out of the continent, but about 60% of inter-African trade is already made up of manufactured goods. This means something important. The market is already there. The big problem is moving goods across borders effectively. And that is why custom infrastructure is needed. This month, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat announced a $3.1 billion customs modification concession aimed at improving digital customs, cargo tracking, and border processes. Sounds boring, right? It's not. Imagine producing a product in the DRC, moving components through Zimbabwe, sending them to Tanzania, assembling them, and selling the final product across Africa without losing days at every border. That is when trade becomes real. That is when regional supply chain becomes possible. That is when an African factory can actually compete. But now let's go even deeper, because there's a global race happening behind all this. The US wants critical minerals. Europe wants critical minerals. China wants critical minerals. India wants critical minerals. Everyone wants a secure access of the resources needed for the next generation of technology. And Africa has something they desperately need: copper, cobalt, lithium, manganese, graphite, rare earth. The world needs these minerals. This means Africa has something it has not been able to use effectively. But here's the catch. Having resources is not the same as having power. When you can process, when you can manufacture, when you can build, when you can say, we don't just have the minerals, we have the infrastructure, we have the skills, we have the factories, and we have the market, and that is economic power. Now imagine a young engineer in Africa develops battery technology. The minerals come from Africa. The refining happens in Africa. The components are manufactured in Africa. The battery is assembled in Africa. African companies buy it. African consumers use it. And eventually, the rest of the world imports it. That is a completely different Africa. Not a continent that simply sells what it has. A continent that builds what the world needs. But here is the question nobody can answer yet. Can Africa actually make this transformation happen? Because the obstacles are enormous. Energy shortage, infrastructure gaps, financing problems, border delays, skills shortage, political instability, and competition from countries that have spent decades building manufacturing capacity. This is not a fairy tale, it's real. Africa could win or remain trapped in the same cycle. Export, import, repeat. For generations, Africa has been told, you have incredible potential. Maybe that's the wrong conversation. Potential does not build factories. Potential does not build data centers. Potential does not manufacture batteries. Execution does. And that's why this moment matters. Because the question isn't whether Africa has resources. We already know it does. And obviously, the world needs these resources. The question is, what will Africa do with its bargaining power? Will we sell the raw materials or will we build industries? Will African resources continue leaving the continent or will become the foundation of the African industries? We may look back at this period as the moment something changed. Not because Africa stopped trading with the world, but because Africa finally started navigating from a position of strength. And that brings us to this question I want you to answer. Should Africa continue restricting raw material exports until enough local processing capacity exists? Yes or no? It's a story about ownership, and ultimately, it's about one question. Who will own Africa's future?